Okay, well, I see a live on YouTube button at the top left, so I think we're good to go. Thanks again, Dana, for helping us get that set up. Welcome, everybody. Again, welcome to our first panel, KCZC 6. This panel is about Zinesters and astrology, herbalism, and witchcraft. Before we begin, I would like to invite everyone watching to join me and our panelists in pausing for a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently inhabiting land that has been stolen from its traditional guardians. This year we have people participating from around the country or even around the world, but here where I am in Kansas City, I'm occupying territory that belongs to the Kansa, Osage, and Shawnee nations. I would also like for us all to acknowledge that our nation was built on a legacy of chattel slavery, the brutal enslavement of Black people whose exploited labor created this nation's wealth, and to affirm that all Black lives matter. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. Like I said, this is our first panel. If you don't know, this is Kansas City ZineCon. Normally, this is an in-person zine fest that takes place in Kansas City, Missouri every year. This year, due to COVID-19, we are meeting virtually. And like I was saying to our panelists before we started, that means that we have the awesome privilege of getting to have panels and other events with people who normally wouldn't be able to make it to Kansas City. So just to kick it off, I think let's go around and have each of our panelists introduce themselves and talk about their zine or their work. So if you could let us know your name and pronouns, where you're joining us from, and like I said, just a little bit about your zine or your artwork. Can we start with Rain?
Sure. Hi, I'm Rain Clark. I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm non-binary. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and my zines focus on non-gendered introductory spellcraft and intro to witchcraft for people who are interested and maybe just a little bit nervous or don't know where to start.
Thanks, Rain. I'm going to go down to whoever's below me on Zoom at this moment, which is Eileen.
Hey folks, this is Eileen. I started my astrology practice under the name Mama Gwe Speaks. And it's all very experimental right now. But I'm doing a little bit on horoscopes, a little bit on like planets, energy signs, and how those might all interact.
And Eileen, you're tuning in from Kansas City, right?
Oh yeah, sorry. I am
You're fine.
in Kansas City.
Awesome, thank you. One of our locals. Let's go over now to Nikki.
Hi, my name is Nikki Miner. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a non-binary femme. I am born and raised in New Orleans, which occupies the land of the United Homa Nation and is also known by indigenous people of the region as Bulbancha. I make zines that are just primarily about an introduction to herbalism. The main goal of a lot of the work that I do is to make herbalism that's accessible, particularly to BIPOC and other marginalized communities.
Awesome, Nikki, glad to have you from New Orleans. And finally, we'll jump down to Neely.
Hi, I'm Neely. I use she, her pronouns. I'm living in Tacoma, traditional Duwamish. Duwamish? No, that's Seattle. Sorry, Puyallup. But I work in Seattle, which is Duwamish land, and they have a really great program called Real Rent Duwamish that I want everyone to know about because they don't have government acknowledgement, and if they did, they would control the waterways, which would be the Port of Seattle. So it's like a big deal that they don't have government acknowledgement. My zines, I've been doing zines for about almost 20 years now. And for a long time, they were just personal zines about trauma and stuff like that. In the last 3 years, I've been writing a lot about witchcraft, like the big witchcraft, the big word. I was raised partially by a practicing neo-pagan / Wiccan who had some pretty severe problems and was incredibly abusive. And I'm using my work to kind of work through that, and then also kind of point out the major problems with neo-paganism, and especially the Wiccan religion, which I would call a spiritual smorgasbord where people just pick and choose whatever they want. And I have some pretty major problems with that as far as cultural appropriation. And I'm also a Jewish person who's been practicing for about 3 years now. And I focus a lot of my traditional magic on Jewish traditional magic and spirituality. So that's me.
Thanks, Neely. And actually, that reminds me, thanks for sharing that resource about the Native people in Washington, because something that Dana did in our earlier workshop that I thought to do and then forgot about is to encourage everyone who's watching from not Kansas City to do some research into the indigenous people who own the land that you are located at. So if that's not Kansas City, then definitely make sure there's a lot of good resources. I think there's even a number you can text to find out based on your geolocation exactly what territory you're on. So definitely encourage everybody to check that out. And also, Neely, you gave me a great segue into the next question, which is just to hear a little bit about our panelists' background with zines. So like how long you've been making zines, how you initially got into zines, and what kind of drew you to this as a medium for art. So if it's okay, I'm going to go to Nikki first to talk to us a little bit about how you got started making chicory.
Sure. So I've been making chicory zine since 2018, so coming up on 2 years here. But I was first introduced to zines kind of in an anarchist sort of book collective space that was here in New Orleans some years ago when I was in college. So that was my introductory kind of level to zines. And then when I was finishing up my studies at UNO, which is the University of New Orleans, I took a class on the beats and started really becoming fascinated with the cutout technique that the beat writers would use. And so that really got me into making zines. And so it all just sort of happened at the right time, going to that zine space and then also taking that class at the same time. And then I just started making zines on my own. And then some friends and I got together and made some zines together as well when I was in college, but those are mostly about music. And then I kind of left it by the wayside for a few years as I graduated and got into, just working for a while. And then I kind of fell back into it because I realized how much I missed it and how much I really just felt the desire to create again. And I just felt like zines were a really perfect way to make the things that I want to share with people about herbalism, particularly in the BIPOC community, that zines are a really great medium to do so because they're really small and they're easy to transport and they're usually self-published and they're cheap. And so I think that really makes it accessible to people who are the most in need of information.
Absolutely. That's really interesting, Nikki. And I feel like maybe some of our other panelists will feel this way too if they have a long history with zines, but I feel like zines are definitely a medium where people tend to come and go from it and go through different periods of making a zine and stepping away and then coming back. I'm going to jump now to Eileen, actually, to see if you can maybe tell us a little bit about your history of zines with Moon Eaters and also just a little bit about the history there.
Yeah, I would love to. So I have a number of overlapping experiences with what Nikki just shared. Also was introduced to zines in an anarchist library up in upstate New York and really gravitated towards the medium because of its accessibility and the idea of like self-publishing and getting information out there felt like a really powerful way to share really important information and resources. So fast forward a few years, I don't know how many, I lived in Boston for a couple of years and there met a community of Asian American queer makers and started collaborating with them on the Moon Eaters Collective, which is part distro and part just like collecting information and submissions from folks in the community with the purpose of, you know, sharing more work from folks of color. So, so that was a majority of my zine work in most recent years. And then I'm sort of like in that falling away phase where I'm exploring different modes of art. And so I'm looking into collaging, digital collaging, and also writing, which honestly is so freaking scary. But I guess that's why I'm doing it, because it's scary, and also why I have an emphasis on like speaking, because like the soul of zine making and sharing all this information is like using your voice and believing in your own perspective. Yeah, I think that's
absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Eileen, for sharing. I'm gonna jump over to Rain now, but real quick, Neely, I noticed you have a cat in frame. Can you, would you like to introduce your cat? Whenever I see one, you know.
This is my cat. Her name's Princess. She was a rescue, and she came with a name. So she's very sweet. I've had her for about 2 years now. She's shy and quiet, but is being really, this is her zone. I'm in the attic and she loves it up here. So she's like, oh, cool, you're hanging out with me. So anyway, sorry, it might be a little distracting.
No, whenever I see one, I'm like, I normally don't get to meet people's cats because cats, you know, stay in people's houses. So
it's true.
Yeah, seize the opportunity, but sorry for the distraction, everybody. Anyway, back to talking about everyone's experience with zines and how you got started with them. Rain, would you like to share about your background?
Sure, I'd love to. I've been self-publishing since 2015, I believe. For me, I discovered zines through friends and local zine fests, and primarily through local comic shops. Fortunately, some of the shops around Michigan had some really well-curated local zine sections. And I immediately became just like super enamored with the whole idea and concept and dove right into it. And initially I used them as a medium more for comics, and then as my personal journey with witchcraft and magic and things like that sort of grew as I met some new people, and just like it was like immediately after college, my worldview was expanding still, and just being able to meet a bunch of different people was so nice, something I think about really fondly right now. And I was exploring a bunch of different magic texts and things I would not read this day, and just thought like, I really want to make something with this like new information I'm learning. And originally it was just something sort of for me for fun. And over the years, it's just become a way to share a sort of combination of my love of magic and witchcraft and sequential art, and specifically how-to comics.
Awesome. Thank you, Rain. That's really interesting. I've never really spent a lot of time in Michigan, so it's interesting to hear that there's a good zine scene there.
There is. There's a really, I feel like maybe everyone says that about their local zine scene, but man, I love it.
I miss it hearing about other places in the Midwest where it's really thriving for sure. Now finally gonna go down to Neely, if you want to tell us a little bit about your history with zines and how you got started.
Yeah, I think I learned about zines from like Riot Girl times. I made my first zine in like 1997, you know, so it was like a little late Riot Girl times, but I was really involved in the like punk community in Seattle, and just knew people who made zines and kind of did it that way, and then took a break. And then when I was in college for about 1.5 years, and I did my first like real zine, and then I did that for a number of years. It's called Mend My Dress. And then after a while I decided that I wanted to publish a book version of it. And then me and my friend Colleen started a book publishing company, putting out zine anthologies, and then running a small distro, which I still run, kind of. I mean, I do it, yeah. It's not like a big part of my life like it was for a few years. And did lots of zine events and traveled a lot, and did a like personal zine writing tour in England with my friend Alexis Wolf. And yeah, just kind of like it was a big part of my life for a long time. And then I got kind of burnt out, I guess, and wanted to shift gears. And so I've been doing this other zine for a while, but it's like I make 10 copies at a time, and that's about it. And eventually I'd like to turn it into a full length like memoir with like editing. Awesome. I don't know.
Yeah, what is editing? I feel like this is Zinester. I don't know that word.
Yeah, right. I'm like, oh, next level. Yeah. Yikes. I don't know.
I know.
But I'm just writing and doing it, and still very much love zines. And there's a small comic shop in Tacoma that for a while was doing quarterly zine events where you could just table for free, and all Tacoma locals would come, and it's very sweet. Hopefully post-COVID times they'll do that again. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks for sharing, everybody. Now our next topic is similar to that, but instead about what your specific practice is. And real quick for everyone watching, I do want to acknowledge that we have some very distinct, disparate practices here. We have an astrologer, we have an herbalist, we have two people who identify as witches. So I'm not trying to say that these are all the same thing, but I just want everyone to get a chance to hear about these different practices and how all of these folks are incorporating that into zine making. So I'm going to start, I think, first with Eileen, actually. We'll go start with the astrology piece. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started doing astrology, what astrology means to you, and maybe like if someone out there is not very familiar with it, just kind of a brief overview of what your practice is.
Okay, let me try not to speak for an entire hour on this. Okay, so I got into astrology about 5 years ago. So I've been learning for 5 years, practicing / consulting for 1 whole year. And so for me, astrology is a language in which we understand the energies around us. So there's a really popular phrase in magic and energetic works in witchcraft, which is as above, so below. And so as above, we have these planets and the circuitous, routes that they take. And I think it's really beautiful that there's a way that we've learned to speak about that and how those energies above are paralleling, that's a word, our lived experiences below. So I've really come to appreciate astrology as a method of understanding where I am in my life roadmap. So some people also think of astrology as your owner's manual that explains everything about you. So that's how I see astrology. In my practice, I believe that astrology is also a practice that gets better with time. I mean, we're constantly observing time in different ways. And in my practice, something that I truly believe in is embodied knowledge. So experiencing transits, living through that experience, embodying the knowledge, and speaking from that particular, source, rather than, because you can read things about your sun, moon, and rising, et cetera, as many times as you would like to from books, but really doing it, working through it, and understanding how you yourself can have grown from it is, I feel the best way to is a better place to speak if you're trying to share that work and that knowledge with others. So not all astrologers are spiritual, but I feel like I envelop a level of that in my personal practice. So I'm sort of like an absorbent learner, and I like everything that I'm interested is folded into my practice. So I have an interest in herbalism, crystals, meditating, and like our connection to our community, not just in our like physical experience, but like thinking about it in a more spiritual way as well. And I hesitate to use the word witch because I feel like there's a cultural connection with witch too. And I just, don't really know what label I prefer to use for myself. So I'm leaving that blank. But that is my interdisciplinary practice that's predominantly shared through astrology.
I suspect that astrology, out of all of the different practices that we have represented on this panel, I think that astrology would probably be the one that most people would be familiar with. I think, especially in the United States, a lot of us tend to know like our sun sign, just as a piece of personal trivia. So thank you so much, Eileen, for sharing the deeper practice of that, and specifically like what it means to you on a spiritual level, because a lot of that I hadn't really thought about before. So really appreciate that explanation. I'm sure everybody watching does as well. I think I'm going to pivot now over to Nikki to talk about your work with herbalism. For those of you who don't know, I think Nikki mentioned this a little bit, but Nikki does run a small batch herbalism shop out of New Orleans. So I would really like for you to share with us how you got started with that work and what that work encompasses for you.
Sure. I'll try to be brief. So the herbalism kind of came before the zines. About 4 years ago, I became familiar with and eventually started interning for an herb shop that's near to my house. I was literally just walking around in my neighborhood a few years ago, and I was like, what is this magical, cute place with these dried herbs? And at that time, I had no I grew up gardening with my mother, so I've always worked with plants my entire life. I've always had a relationship with plants, but never up until about 4 years ago in like a formal sense. And it just sort of happened in this very like organic way that I can only describe as being kismet. Like literally 4 years ago, a good friend of mine, I was just like, thinking like I would love to be more self-reliant and learn more about incorporating like herbs into my life. And so a friend gave me a book sat on my bookshelf for a year, never really gave it much thought. And then it's like I came across the herb shop, saw that they were looking for interns, didn't know a thing about herbalism, but I was like, I got this herb book, let me start looking at it. And so everything just kind of fell into place. I got the internship, and through there, I was able to like learn and get hands-on experience and just start working with the medicine right away. I think that that's like something that's really key for a lot of people who want to be involved with herbalism. And so I think that like for those who are interested in learning more about herbalism and maybe working with the herbs in a way that's more community facing, to definitely try to find like a mentor. I think that that's like so important to find a mentor. And so, yeah, I definitely shy away from the label of herbalist. I don't consider myself an herbalist. I consider myself a practitioner of folk herbalism that's very much steeped in BIPOC traditions, particularly those in the South, because I was born and raised in New Orleans and my family is from Southern Mississippi. So it's really important to me to incorporate that into the work that I do with plants, because that's something that's been a part of my family and my greater, larger BIPOC community's heritage for so long. So that's definitely something that's a part of my work. And I'm just about making like herbalism accessible. I feel like there's a lot of gatekeeping, and I feel like there's just like a lot of like just technical jargon. And I think that there are people who are generally interested in incorporating plants into their self-care and preventative health routines, but there's just so much of a barrier of getting the knowledge, getting into the spaces where they can actually interact with the herbs, and then also just working with people who are culturally competent and can like actually break down, you know, not like break it down, but like make it something that is accessible to them. I think it's all about the packaging and the branding and like who's delivering that, and like, you know, just like, you know, naming things, you know, like naming, you know, like just making spaces more comfortable and accessible for people who like traditionally might not be in those herb spaces. So that's something that is like a huge part of my work. And so I definitely incorporate that into my zines. And so basically I started making herbal medicine preparations and selling those preparations, and then donating part of that to a local bail fund. And then I don't know, just kind of started just getting inspired and making zines. And so I decided to incorporate that into my sort of small business to sell small batch medicinals as well as the zines together, but within the zines writing about being able to use knowledge of plant medicine to like empower yourself and like liberate yourself from larger harmful systems like the medical industrial complex. I know that's a really deep answer, but that pretty much sums up a lot of my work.
I appreciate that a lot. Also, real quick, I'm sorry if I referred to you as an herbalist earlier. That was wrong. My apologies on that. But I have just a quick follow-up question on that. For someone who's never used herbal healing of any kind, can you talk a little bit more about what that like physically looks like, or just like logistically, like what are they? You mentioned preparations. Like, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so really where it started was tinctures, and tinctures are basically just like generally alcohol-based plant extractions. It's like they come in a little dropper bottles. And so I was like, great, I can make tinctures and I can like sell them and raise the money. But as far as the preparations that I make, I do tincture a lot of things. I do sometimes do like skincare products. And right now a really huge push and goal of mine is to make like skincare products, tea blends and tinctures and like other like liquid herbal extractions with herbs that I grow in my garden. So that's like also a really huge piece, and just like a part of like a bigger kind of liberation through plants. I don't know if that's making any sense. And I wouldn't say like healing as much as like I really believe in like acute integrative plant medicine. Like I'm not saying don't go to a doctor. I definitely believe in going to a doctor. However, I do think that there's so many, we carry with us so much plant knowledge, like from our like culture and family and communities. And I think that like to completely ignore that and just look to, Western medicine, and that's, I mean, I don't know what other term to use, but like would be like a disservice. I think that like you should really like, yes, go to the doctor if you're sick. Any person who works with herbs who, uses caution will tell you that. However, I do think like it's worth exploring, like incorporating plants for like gently helping with acute health problems over time. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, that really helps a lot, because I think for a lot of people who've only grown up being exposed to Western medicine, I think it's hard to even imagine what a different system looks like. So I appreciate having you here to help us all get more familiar with that. I'm going to jump now to, I'll go to Neely this time, just to talk a little bit about your personal experience with witchcraft and what that looks like for you and how you got started with it, as much as you are interested in sharing.
Yeah, like I said in my intro, I guess, my one of my parents, I kind of count myself as having three. It was my mom, my dad, and my dad's wife. And she was practicing neo-pagan, and that kind of looked like she had a big garden, and she grew a lot of plants that she used within her spellcrafting. And she had a room with lots of books and tarot cards and candles and crystals and music. And I wasn't allowed in there because I had evil spirits inside me, and I would corrupt her magic, which led to a lot of like emotional problems for me as someone who wanted to get into, you know, witchcraft is kind of, you know, a way to have control over your life that in aspects of your life that you can't control, right? But she was, you know, called herself a white witch and didn't practice black magic and had this very binary view of what was okay to do and what was not. And for whatever reason, I was bad. And then, you know, so I was like interested in what she was doing, but I also knew that it was like deeply flawed. And I read a lot of her books, even though I wasn't supposed to. I would like go in there when she was at work or like doing whatever. And I read a bunch of stuff, and a lot of it is totally unhelpful. I was mostly interested in the herbalism books that she had, and mostly interested in like the sex books, because there was a lot of like sex magic stuff that I was like really interested in because I was like 12 and I was like, ooh, you know, what's sex about, kind of. But I was really terrified to do any kind of spell crafting because I was, you know, kind of indoctrinated with this idea that I was a bad person and had bad spirits inside of me. And then I mean, I think I did my first spell maybe 5 years ago. And then recently I've been taking classes through the School of Traditional Magic in Seattle. And my teacher there is just this really incredible Polish Romani woman who just is incredible. And the magic that she teaches comes from a place of queer, trans-centered traditional magic with the focus on finding traditions that are from your personal background, whether you know that or not. And I know for me, as you know, a Euro-American, I'm pretty privileged in that I actually know where most of my family came from through just family knowledge brought down, and then also, you know, the science of DNA testing. So she's kind of like, if you know, that's great. So you can, you know, I can look to Polish magic or Scottish magic or Northern Italian magic or Jewish magic. And then for people who don't have access to that information, it's kind of just like, she's just like, guess, you know, like, where do you kind of think your family's from, you know, based on what you know. And she really focuses on that, which I think is an important part. And that, you know, there's no good magic and bad magic. It's all just, you know, it's all just magic. And kind of just, you know, takes apart the, you know, like incredibly racist ideas of like what is bad magic, because a lot of that bad magic is like, especially in like Wiccan tradition, it's like you're not allowed to do any spells that control someone. You're not allowed to do any spells for money. You're not allowed to do any spells that's like, you know, other than the most basic protection. You're not allowed to hex people, you know, all these things that like, yeah, maybe someone like my stepmom who's like a middle-class white lady would never have to worry about, you know, but like that's not the reality for a lot of people. Like sometimes you need to control your landlord. Sometimes you need to like hex the fucking cop, you know? Like, and we did this big group. She didn't ask or tell everyone to do it, but everyone in our class that was interested in doing it did a collective banishment on the mayor of Seattle, which has had some pretty interesting repercussions. I don't know, none of you guys are in Seattle, so maybe you don't know. But it's just, yeah, so just kind of doing that and then researching a lot about the Jewish traditions as far as the Jewish take on astrology, the Jewish take on the moon, the Jewish take on tarot, in which, you know, tarot is a very Romani based practice, but it also has a lot of Judaism in it. The Kabbalah is a big part of tarot, and a lot of people don't understand that Kabbalah is a closed segment of a closed religion, and that, like, I'm not saying people shouldn't use tarot that aren't Jewish or don't have the privilege to study Kabbalah, but it's like something to keep in mind, along with a lot of other practices that people kind of, you know, engage in, such as like white sage or Palo Santo, or like, you know, wearing your chakra necklace if you weren't raised, knowing what that was, or, you know, just all these kind of things. It's like, and that's like a big commitment of mine to, as far as making sure my practices are in the right way and that they're done with good relationships. And then also like informing other like people about what harm they might be perpetuating in their practice. So.
Awesome, Neely. Thank you so much for sharing about
Great.
that. There's a lot there. And we're going to talk more about a lot of that stuff. Thank you again for teeing me up for that later. But before we get to that, I want to just give Rain a chance to share about their experience with getting started with witchcraft. I know earlier you mentioned the books. It sounds like that's kind of a common theme for everyone here. But go ahead and give us a little background on that.
Yeah, so I was raised by a Christian and Jewish parent, respectively. And growing up, neither of those exactly jived with me. And it led to a lot of things being like forbidden or off limits, such as tarot, things like that, where it was like stuff that I just immediately was interested in, stuff that was, you know, considered mysticism or things like that. Anything mildly witchy or just like not Christian was not okay. And so for a long time, I thought that Wicca was the only kind of like magical practice, because I had a very sheltered upbringing, very Christian upbringing. And so it wasn't until I was out on my own, reading a lot of books and finding a lot of things that just like didn't jive with me, or stuff that I already at that point knew was just like inherently appropriative, things like spirit animals and stuff like that, where I was just like, this is obviously not okay. I don't know why this is in here, why it's still in here. And there was also just a lot of gendered magic, and that was a huge, I guess, fork in the road for me, sort of. And so I began just sort of finding things that I could use to create personal rituals that were primarily like excuse me, I just said that in like a British accent, color or like symbol based, things that weren't really taking from like a specific culture or something like that, things just like, you know, colors, candles, stones, trying to find things that had personal meaning to me that I could relate to, what I did know about either side of my family, my upbringing, what personally felt right to me and what I could relate to. And my magic and witchcraft has evolved to just sort of be a way to like sit and listen and learn. And it's a lot of learning lately, but I'm excited about that. And using sort of my my illustration and comics background, wanting to share things with people who were sort of in a similar place where they didn't really jive with summoning, you know, a masculine, feminine deity, or subscribing to summoning archangels or something like that. So it's just sort of like queer magic for people who don't super have a religion, I guess. But again, I think my stuff is very introductory and basic, but hopefully I can make some more advanced things as I learn and grow older.
For sure. Thanks for sharing, Rain. I do want to be able to have plenty of time to talk about something that a lot of you guys have already brought up, being a lot of the barriers that exist in your respective spaces for people who are marginalized or underrepresented in any way or under-resourced. But real quick, I just want to go around real quick and maybe do a short answer of what motivated you to start making a zine about your respective practice. So let's just go reverse. So let's start with Rain, and we'll go back up that order of like, just real quick, what made you want to make a zine about your individual practice?
I'll try and give a short answer. I believe what really prompted me was wanting to have something physical for a zine festival. And in 2015 or 16, I was collaborating with another local witch who specialized in totally different aspects of what I was into. And we wanted to do like a magic collective. And so that was what I made my first zine for. And it was the first iteration of my zine Witch Tips, which I've redesigned and added to, I think, 3 times since then.
Cool, thank you. Neely, what about you?
I had just felt really connected to a lot of people through my previous zines, and I wanted to find a way to connect with other Jewish traditional magic practitioners. The main thing.
Cool, thank you. And then Nikki, what about you? I think you touched on this a little bit, but
I think actually it's Eileen's turn and then me.
Is that so? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Eileen, can you go ahead? I know that you maybe don't have a zine specifically about astrology out there right now, but maybe are you planning on one? Is that something you'd consider?
Well, I think I'll just talk about my art, like why did I feel motivated to collage or write about astrology? So I feel like that all was inspired by me wanting to explore my role and identity as a healer. Like, saying that out loud still feels really scary. But there's like I'm really interested in it. You know, like when you share an interest with other people and you hear them talking about a thing, like you wanna like hop in. And I was finding that I had like the things that I was thinking about were being affirmed and also said elsewhere in the our digital living room, social media. So I think that was also another thing that compelled me. And it's just really exciting when you feel like you have like an interesting take that you want to share that could potentially help somebody else.
For sure. Thanks, Eileen. And then Nikki, will finish with you.
Sure. I think the main reason I started making zines was just to increase accessibility. When I first started selling the tinctures, I had friends that were interested. They're like, oh, I want to support what you're doing. You know, you're donating part of your funds to this cause, but I want to know more about like the function of the herbs. So that's kind of really where it started from. So my very first chicory zine is like really simple. It's like 8 pages because I was like, I literally want someone, if they're a mother of 5 on food stamps, to be able to pick this up and be able to make medicine out of it. I want it to be super simple. I want it to be something that like, if you're transient, you could just put it in your back pocket. And so I then about a year later came out with the 2nd edition of chicory, which is like more like basically just like a more expanded version of the first one, but just but with that really clear objective of just like making things like providing accessible herbal information, accessible recipes, and just like an encouraging note to just be like, try these out and maybe share these recipes with a family member, because that's the larger focus of like why I make zines and like why I name that issue Plants for Liberation, because I do think through utilizing the zine in that way can help achieve that goal.
Cool, thanks for sharing. I think that a lot of you have already touched on this topic, that the next chunk of what we're going to talk about. So I think that we're in a really good place for this discussion, which is the barriers that people in certain groups face in these respective practices. So I know Rain and Neely, you both mentioned there's a lot of cultural appropriation that runs pretty rampant in certain corners of witchcraft. And I know that Nikki and Eileen, you're certainly familiar with some of those barriers as well. Is this something that you address in your zines directly? Like, do you talk about the racist history of certain practices, or racist specific practices that people do? Is that something that you guys address, or is it something that you would address in the future? Can I start with Rain?
Sure. It's not something I have not addressed racism specifically in my zine. I have addressed, trying to think of how to phrase it, I guess sort of like ableism and gatekeeping in my zine. At the beginning of all of my zines, I state that if there's anything that is not accessible to you, not purchasable to you, something that makes you uncomfortable, that there are things that you can switch out. And a lot of those sort of substitutions I try and call out in my zine. But because I am a self-publisher, based on this, I realized that I should be addressing that. So thank you. I really appreciate you bringing up an opportunity for me to improve. I want to address certain things, like certain common practices in my witch tip zine, since there are, I think, a lot of things where people commonly think of, like we mentioned before, white sage, Palo Santo, spirit animals, voodoo, just like some really common, I think, ideas of what witchcraft is to like the mainstream white magic, or I don't mean white magic, I mean like white person magic audience. I feel like I should probably be adding a page that calls out, like, here are some really common examples of things that we don't do this here, this is not okay, and here's why. So yeah, that's something I'll be adding to my zines in the future. Thank you for asking and prompting that.
Cool. Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned gatekeeping, because when I was initially putting this panel together, I had a great conversation actually with Nikki about what specific types of aggressions that Black people specifically tend to face in the zine community, and also in the herbalism, astrology, and witchcraft communities, respectively. And Nikki brought up that a lot of it is not so much about like overt acts of racism, but more so about, like you said, gatekeeping, and also Nikki mentioned erasure is a big part of it. Nikki, I'm wondering if you can speak to that next, actually, to shed some light on that for us.
Yeah, so that's a lot of, like, so anyone who follows me on social media, you know that, like, I'm in it every day talking about that. And so I think, like, it's kind of twofold. So I guess I'll talk about the herbalism piece first, and then like the zine world too. Since my work overlaps. Definitely in the herbalism world, like, yeah, like, think about it. Most herb shops, and any town that you go to, if there is an herb shop, is probably white owned. A lot of the big herb bulk distributing companies are white owned. And just in general, like, there's just, like, if you Google herbalist, it will pull up a picture of like a white woman that looks like Rosemary Gladstar. And so there's just this whole notion of like this like separation, I think, for Black people with like working with plants and working with the land. And so one book that does like a really great example of kind of like undoing some of that erasure is Farming While Black, which is a book by Leah Penniman. And so it talks about like how like herbalism, like Black people, people of African descent have been incorporating and using plants for centuries. It just may not be under the name of herbalism, if that makes sense. And also there's a lot of popular white herbalists who've appropriated and stolen work from herbalists of color. So like, that's just like a thing right there. So I think like the main thing that, you know, people like white, and I'm also gonna say this non-Black, because like, I think it's important too, to make the distinction like people of color, because there's a lot of white passing people of color. So I think just like making that distinction of like Black, Indigenous, people of color is like really important. So I think that like for white herbalists that own land and own businesses and things like that, like, again, I'm thinking like back to that piece I said about mentorship is really important. If it weren't for the mentor that I had, she is white and she does own a shop, but if it wasn't for that opportunity to allow me to be a mentor, I wouldn't, for her to mentor me, I should say, I wouldn't have been able to learn and then turn around and then disseminate that information in my community. So I think that's a really important piece that white people could do and non-Black people could do, is just really think about gatekeeping and like mentorship and just like allowing people opportunities to like empower themselves. Like, I don't need handouts. I need tools so that I can like do this on my own and like, you know. And then I would think I think also in the zine world, there's just like a huge erasure of like BIPOC history in zines. Like, one of the first forms of a zine was the Combahee River Statement, which was literally a pamphlet, right? Like, that's what zines were originally from, pamphlets and chapbooks. And so I think, you know, and there were a lot of Black punks, you know, so I just think there's just like a lot of erasure of like Black people's involvement in making zines. And so I think that's like a huge thing. And I think doing things like making sure you have like a diverse zine panel, or like it's like diverse like tabling or whatever, or like some sort of like built-in, again, mentorship opportunities for like people to get interested in it. Because I think that some people just don't know what zines are. So then just like being like, what are we doing as an organization to like teach people like what are zines? Like, you could even do, I think they're speaking tomorrow, but Alex Lima of Ulterior Zines in Atlanta does like a really awesome like library, like free zine education pop-up thing for teens. And I think it's like doing stuff like that is something that white and non-Black zinesters could do to alleviate some of this racism that we see and experience.
Thanks for all that information, Nikki, and especially for mentioning Alexa, because we are actually meeting with them tomorrow in a similar panel that is going to be specifically for BIPOC zinesters to talk about their zines and their work and their experience. So definitely, if you're interested in any of that, definitely tune in tomorrow, because it's going to be a really important, I think, panel for everyone in the zine community to really hear and have a chance to listen to those voices. I'm going to go next to Neely to talk a little bit about their experience or how they handle these issues in their zines, if they do.
Yeah, I write a lot about it in my zines, particularly around the things that I saw my stepmom kind of doing, you know, with her, you know, binary views, and then also other things like she was a really big fan of like native flute music that was always like these white guys, and it was just really like, man, you know. So I talk about that a lot in my zines, and I talk about like, yeah, it's just like a big kind of like a big focus, especially for the first 3 issues, because I was really like talking a lot about like the things that were happening that were I viewed as problematic, even as like a really young person who didn't have that much of an education. And I grew up in a small community that was very, very, very white, like incredibly white. Outside of Seattle, this little island. And then just, you know, things that I see, you know, people that I know doing now that they're not aware of, and like the things that I learn like on a, you know, weekly basis that I'm like, oh, that's where that's from, or, oh, you know, and talk about a lot of my own issues around people appropriating Jewish culture and their magic, you know, like Aleister Crowley and all these types that are very like, ooh, this scary Hebrew language, and you know, stuff like that.
Sorry.
Are you laughing at me?
It was a legitimate cough, but I also
okay. I was like, I mean, you can totally laugh because it's it's everywhere, you know. And just, you know, stuff like that. Yeah, it's a focus.
Is there anything that you think, like given how this past summer the Black Lives Matter movement has really come more into focus in the United States, which it should have been all along. But do you think that that is changing how you're going to approach this stuff in any future zines that you make?
Oh gosh. I don't know, because I feel like the Black Lives Matter movement has been a big focus of my energy and my care for a while. And I feel like this year it's obviously been a much bigger deal for a lot of people, particularly for a lot of white people, who are kind of just sort of fucking figuring it out. Sorry to, it's YouTube, whatever. And I think it might have some effect in that maybe I I don't know, because it's been a big part of my life for a while.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot there.
No. I don't feel put on the spot at all. I feel like maybe it's just something that maybe I want to, use my work a little more to give platform to people who are speaking to it, Black people specifically, because a lot of times I feel like I don't have much of a platform, but actually maybe I do, and use that more and work on republishing this book that I put out a long time ago that's out of print right now. Anyway.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for providing some context on that.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump over now to Eileen to talk a little bit about racism, and specifically like gatekeeping and erasure and what that looks like in the astrology world, and how you can address that in your work.
Yes. Okay. So I think part of that is, as we are all doing as non-Black POC and white folks, is understanding like how to stay in our lane and support Black folks in our community. And so one of the, I don't explicitly have a racism 101 in the astrology community essay or zine or collage. But I find that a lot of the things that I'm thinking about organically come through my work. And so examples of this include the interconnectedness of capitalism and racism, and how accessibility can oftentimes be financial and class related, and also how like capitalism has informed our approach to property, which obviously has a lot of roots in slavery, and thinking about like how we talk about these things through horoscopes, how we talk about these things when you're interpreting a Pluto return of the United States Pluto return, for example. We like to think that astrology, sort of like law and science and data, is just facts, but there most definitely is analytical overlay, and you can talk about these energies through any type of perspective that you bring to the table. And so the perspective that I choose to bring is one that is conscious of the ways that we are learning and growing as a nation about things that we've taken for granted in our systems, and the way that some folks have been like historically lifted up and oppressed. So that comes out in my language. And there's also, and I also like to think about like the history and the context of the study of astrology. In Western astrology, which is the modality that I practice, all of our planets and like mythos and like psyche of like interpreting it in, I don't know, I'm just gonna stop using those words. But it all comes from like a Greek and Roman history, which was very patriarchal and very, I mean, we understand it to be very binary today, but I think we're also learning about like how it's been very queer until recently, like filtered through a binary heteronormative lens. So I think keeping that in mind also is incredibly useful when I'm thinking about how I communicate and how I like rinse all of this knowledge and talk about it in my work. So not just using like he, him pronouns when talking about, I don't know, the sun. Thinking about how like Mercury and Uranus are like really queer planets, or sometimes Venus is a boy, like, or uses she, they pronouns. It doesn't really, like, they're just planets, like. So like thinking about like with what we know and are continuing to learn and grow in knowledge-wise, like how that can be projected into our work. Something that Nikki talked about that I would also like to speak upon is like thinking about how we can institutionalize these changes. So if you're involved in a zine organization, or if you're involved in like any type of larger org that has a larger platform, like there's ways for you to institutionalize these changes. So it's not just up to you to ensure that like we continue to talk about astrology, herbalism, magic in through a lens of racial justice and our queer experience. So yeah, I'm just gonna, yeah.
Thanks, Eileen. And thanks for touching more on the like trans exclusive history of astrology. That's not something that I had really thought about very much, of how that's a relatively recent thing. So really good information there and some really good insight. Thank you. We are unfortunately out of time, so we are going to have to go ahead and wrap up. I think here for the very last go around of questions, I just want to give everybody a chance to tell the audience about your work, where they can purchase your zines or your other work, where they can find you on social media. And if you have like one quick tip for someone who out there is watching and thinking about starting a zine, if you maybe want to offer one quick tip for them getting started, just as a parting word. I'm going to start down at the bottom of my screen with Neely.
My work is available on Basecamp page. Is it Basecamp? No, that's the music. Sorry, Big Cartel. Mend My Dress Press. If you just Google it, my publishing company will come up, and I'm on Instagram as a personal account, and my zine publishing distro account is there too. And I think my number one tip for making zines for someone who's just starting out is make your margins bigger than you think you need, and write very deeply, like literally, like make it dark, because I've seen a lot of people's first attempts that don't photocopy well. So really, really think black and white. Bold. All right.
Good tip, Neely. All right, I'm going to jump up to Eileen.
You can find my work on Instagram and my website. It's Mamagui Speaks, so MAMAGUI Speaks. And then one quick advice, just do it. There's so many like, what if, or like, what if I do it wrong? What if I don't do it like the way I like? You'll never know until you just jump in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eileen. I'm going to go next on my screen is Nikki.
Sure. People who are interested in following me or learning more about the work that I do can find me on Instagram. I'm a pretty active Instagrammer, so it's just chicory, like the herb chicory, and zine, no spaces. And my email address is chicoryzine@gmail.com. I also have a web store on Big Cartel, so it's chicoryzine.bigcartel.com, and that's where you can find my zines. And I would say the biggest piece of advice is kind of like what Eileen said, just do it. Maybe start with a one-pager. And if you are gonna start with a bigger than a one-pager, I would do either half-page zines are really easy to do. Quarter-page zines can be a little trickier, and one thing that I found really helpful when I made my zines, when I was laying it out, was because I used a collage technique. I used, I guess it's called packing tape. It's like not super sticky and won't rip the paper. So that way I could move stuff around and be like, oh, that looks really weird. And so like, it gave me the ability to like move stuff around, because you may think it looks really cool and then you copy it and you're like, half of it's backwards. So just make your proof, like your original copy that you may do on a photocopier, like make it to where like you can maybe move it around a little bit, just in case like the page is copy strange. And there's tons of tips online.
Absolutely. I feel like copying something backwards by accident is a Zinester rite of passage. So thanks for the tip on that one, Nikki. And finally, Rain, if you would tell us a little bit about where we can find your work and one quick tip.
My tip was definitely going to be start with a one-pager and don't forget to flip your art. You can find my work and a link to my store at rainklar.com, RAYNEKLAR. And then I'm on most social media at small witch. Small witch was taken. Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of a different tip. Yeah, I would suggest starting with a one-pager. Don't forget to flip your art, and don't forget to put what date you made it on, or what year you made the zine on. That's like my biggest regret looking back on a lot of stuff is, when did I make this? And always save at least one copy of all your zines for yourself, and then give all the rest away or sell them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rain. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us on this panel. Thank you to everyone who is watching on YouTube. If you weren't able to watch this live and you're watching this on the recording, I recommend that we do have it closed captioned. And if you're watching it live and the closed captions weren't that good, when we repost it, the captioning is going to be done by our sponsor, Moosator. So it's going to be much better the second time around. So if you struggled with the caption this time, it'll be better to watch it back. I do want to invite everyone who's watching on YouTube right now to join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Central Time for our BIPOC Zinesters panel. We're going to get the chance to talk with 4 really awesome Zinesters and hear about their work and hear about their experiences in the zine community. So definitely come check that out. Thanks so much for watching. I think that's it, everybody. All right, goodbye.
Thank you so much.